In this video, you're going to learn how Gotham Chess likes to take on the Caro-Kann. Now, normally he's the one to advocate it for black, but for white, it can be a bit boring to play against. So Gotham has some really theoretical, some fun lines to spice up the game. So let's take a look at them. We'll look at two matches against titled players. He has some crazy accuracy in both, and you'll get to learn a thing or two about these positions. So the first match we'll look at, he's up against the FM Milos TB, and Gotham always responds here with d4. 99% of players will always respond with d5, and he likes to play the advanced variation where you push your pawn forward. So there's two main variations for black. The first one we'll look at is when they immediately push c5, which is in this match, but the other variation is when they bring their bishop out early. That's a really fun line, so we'll get to watch that one later, but the more popular response you'll see is pushing the pawn to c5. Now, most beginner players here will try and hang on to this pawn, and they'll play it a bit like a French. They might play c3, black will bring their knight out, putting more pressure here, you bring your knight out as well, and then this light square bishop can come here, and this pin can get really annoying. So we don't want to worry about any of this. What Levy does is he just takes this pawn, and this is a really fun line. It doesn't happen often when you're playing with the black side either, so you're going to catch your opponents off guard, and here's how the games generally go. So they'll first generally bring their knight out, attacking this pawn, and again, we don't really want to defend it with our knight because this bishop comes out. There's two main moves. What I like to do in my games is I like to pin this knight with my bishop. Again, I'm trying to hold on to both these pawns and be greedy. But what Levy does is he pushes f4. So this is great because now he's never worried about this pawn. But what black will do is now respond by pushing e6. This bishop is now in jail, but they are threatening to take this pawn. But we can continue to be annoying. Gotham's next move is to defend the pawn with his own bishop. Now, black can get this pawn back with perfect play, but especially if you're a beginner, I think you should try and hang on to this pawn. I'll show you later how black gets it back, but for now, I'll show you a few mistakes that black can run into. The first one that you might see a lot is they might play queen a5 check. The idea is they're trying to add another attacker to that pawn to recapture it, but here's an important tactic to remember. You can play c3 so that when they recapture, you then have b4. You fork the queen and the bishop, and you're going to win that piece. So definitely remember that tactic. And other than that, unless they know this move, which is d4, which we see in the game, it can be a little bit difficult to hang on to that pawn. So definitely think about trying to reinforce it with your pawns in your own game. But let's see what Levy likes to do when he's faced with a move like this. So first off, he has to move his bishop out of danger. But what you might notice is this pawn is very far advanced. It's actually going to still be very difficult for black to maintain that pawn because it's just so far in our territory. So even though black wins the pawn back immediately, we're going to go after that in the long run. So the game continues with Levy developing as normal, and so does our opponent. This is a really common move in these kind of structures because this knight normally would be able to get taken by our dark squared bishop, but it's living over here now, and that can be a really nice square for our knight, or possibly it could jump forward to harass this bishop. So Levy centralizes his knight, and it's asked this bishop a question. Does it want to stay on this diagonal and keep the pressure, will keep defense of that pawn, or drop back, and the opponent decides to drop back. But now, already, Levy continues to develop his piece, and now we have three attackers on this pawn, and black doesn't have a great way to defend it. If he were to jump his knight forward, that would defend the pawn, but I think Levy would be pretty happy to push g4 there, start kicking this knight around, and cause some problems. So, black just decides to castle, and he ends up sacrificing the pawn back. You can see from the evaluation that it's still a solid advantage for Levy, but nothing crazy. But this is really common when you do take that pawn out of the opening in the Caro-Kann like we watched. You tend to get these advantages. So Gotham's up a pawn right now, so black doesn't really want to trade queens. So he throws in this check on a5. But Gotham insists. He wants this queen trade. And again, black declines, which makes a lot of sense. They've sacrificed a pawn. They need to really utilize these open and semi-open files now to make to get that compensation. So Levy just continues to develop normally, eyeing up potentially that king side and defending the knight here. And black jumps the knight forward. He wants to harass this bishop, and Levy's okay with it. He just decides to castle, give up the bishop pair, but his pieces are nicely placed here. You can see he's starting to already potentially line up a nice kingside attack. So black in this position is getting ready to fianchetto his bishop. Levy brings his other rook just closer to the party, reinforcing this knight as well if this bishop decides he wants to move. The bishop eventually gets onto that fianchettoed square, and we have the queen rerouting. Already, you can see it might get a bit suspect. There's a lot of firepower on the king side already, and Gotham is going to be going for checkmate. So black doesn't like that there's this x-ray between the queen and the king here, so they step to the side. But Levy follows them. He wants to keep on this path, and now we're starting to see that these pieces might combine for checkmate. So that's why you see that black pushes this pawn. But now the problem is, this is a hook. So when Levy does decide he wants to storm these pawns up the board, it's going to be a lot harder to stop his kingside attack. And as I say that, already Gotham is going for g4. The kingside attack has already started, and black isn't respecting it just yet, just deciding to improve the placement of his rook. Gotham continues to push his pawns forward. I think the idea here is to restrict this bishop. Now this bishop can't see anything on the king side. And this is the moment where black decides to start trading pieces. Obviously, if the knight were about to jump there, it would have been a beautiful outpost. So, trades the knight. Levy brings the rook up. There's this annoying check, but Levy just decides to run his king up. It can be a bit suspect when you are attacking on the king side, but relatively speaking, this king is reasonably safe. It's actually black that's going to be in a lot of trouble if these pawns continue to go up the board. Now, Gotham is still up a pawn here, so endgames should still favor him, but there's obviously a lot of pressure going on this king side. So black decides, let's try and take the heat away a bit. Maybe let's offer some exchange of pieces. But Gotham just decides to keep the tension, get the queen out of the way, get ready for this h-pawn to start going up the board and potentially get some checkmate threats. Black decides to coordinate his rooks, and here comes that pawn from Gotham. Black decides to finally trade off that rook. Levy recaptures with the queen, and now black is starting to get some counterplay at least. This queen is hit with tempo. This is a really nicely centralized rook. So Levy just retreats, and now black is threatening some counterplay. He wants to go after this b2 pawn, win that pawn back finally, but Levy keeps pushing that h-pawn. And this is where black makes the big blunder that costs him the game. Black thinks they have a free pawn here, and they take on b2, finally getting that material equality. But if you just saw, the evaluation skyrocketed, and that's because it is mate in 3 in this position. You can pause for a second if you want to try and find it. But the key move is this queen can swing all the way to the corner of the board, a8 check, and when the king tries to run away, it's a pawn checkmate. Levy would have been very happy with that. Pawn checkmates are always very satisfying. So that's the first match. Let's jump into the next one. We're going to look at a different setup for the Caro-Kann. This one's my personal favorite. It's a lot of fun to play. So we're back to our starting position, the advanced Caro-Kann, and it's a new opponent. It's knight f3, c5. So I guess he's got a creative name. And this match will be up against this setup. So I think this is called like the classical or something. I'm not sure. But this is your other move that you'll see most of the time. And Gotham has an awesome response to this. It is so fun. You play the move h4, which just looks silly. But the reason behind it is if black isn't careful and just plays e6, which looks super normal, this bishop is suddenly trapped. You play g4. They think, oh, I have f3. No, you don't. They have to go back. And then they're trapped. This is an awesome opening trap to know. You're going to catch so many players off, especially if you're a beginner. They won't see this much at all. But let's look at the other most common responses to this. Once we played h4, the two common responses are either h6 or h5, and I'll quickly run you through both. So both of them, the idea is you're giving this escape square for the bishop. So if they play h6, we're going to play g4 anyway. You play g4, you force this bishop back, and then the key move to remember here is you play this pawn sacrifice. You play e6. Now, the reason behind this is basically when they take, you offer this exchange of bishops, and in this situation, you can see our queen is heading for this square. Black's not going to be able to castle, and worse, they just can't develop very easily. This bishop is kind of trapped between its own pawns that can't move very easily. Like we said, this king is super trapped, so try this line out. It's super fun. You also jump your knight forward to harass that king and potentially go for forks here. So I love playing this variation, and this is the most common at the beginner and intermediate level. So we're back to our original position here. The next main move to know is when they play h5. This is the other common response. This stops our fun with g4, but you can bring your bishop to g5, and what this does is it pins the e-pawn. They can't move it, well, they still might, and they'll blunder their queen. And the idea is we're still looking for this push. So let's say they develop. You again offer this trade of bishops. They still can't push this pawn. And let's say maybe they just move the queen randomly. Now comes that pawn push. So keep that in mind. I'll show you one really fun variation in this line as well, which again just integrates all these aspects. Basically, in this situation, they want to unpin their queen. So they bring the queen out here and they counterattack this pawn. And you can actually sacrifice this pawn and this rook. It's an awesome line to know. Basically, you just ignore everything. You go, hey, let me trade. You trade, and then they take this. and you completely sacrifice your rook. You play e6, which looks ridiculous. Stockfish at a low depth isn't convinced either, but if you let it run, especially in game review, it'll say this is the best move, and you just sacrifice your rook, and it's totally fine because you have to remember this queen b3 move, and the idea is you have so much counterplay. This queen is coming for b7. This queen is actually almost trapped as well. If they hang around too long, you can develop your knight, and it's trapped. It doesn't have any squares to go. So this is such a fun line. You've sacrificed a full rook, but you're still better, and this is the kind of fun that you have out of the Tau variation. So let's jump back to the Gotham game. Let's see how he beats a titled player in this variation. So Gotham's opponent likes to play h6 here, and like we saw, the plan is to play g4, and he plays a bit of a goofy move. He drops his bishop back. Now, I've never seen this before, but Gotham just develops as normal, and then he pushes his h-pawn. So maybe he got a bit confused. Maybe he wanted to play that immediate h5 variation. So Gotham takes, he brings his bishop back, so it's very similar to what we saw earlier, except Black's down a tempo. And like you saw, this is a very aggressive opening, so Black can't really afford to do this, and you can see it's already plus 1.35 on the engine. So, like we saw earlier, Gotham just offers an exchange of pieces, and Black plays e6. Now, if Black didn't play e6 in this position, you know that Gotham would have played e6, and with all this tempo they're down, that could have been a disaster. So, still, obviously, great position for Gotham, but not going to win the game just yet. He now develops his knight, develops his bishop, and castles queenside. This is the kind of situations you can get. You can see it's already going to be very aggressive. And the nice situation is because they played the Caro-Kann, they always have this awkward pawn on c6. So it makes castling queenside for Black a little bit more dangerous as well. Now, if you've noticed, this pawn has been hanging for a while now, but I think it would be a bit too risky for Black to take it. You can see they're already behind in development, and that's why you see them prioritizing that. They now develop their knight, blocking this bishop because it was stopping Black from queenside castling, and Gotham continues to just develop his pieces, get them closer to the action, and Black makes a really big mistake here. I'm not really sure what they were thinking, but they underdeveloped their knight, getting ready to swing it over to the queenside. Maybe they just thought that their king would be a lot safer in the center, but you can see the evaluation has skyrocketed, and Gotham just makes them pay just perfectly here. He just pushes this f-pawn, preparing this break here, trying to open up these files and get to that exposed king in the center. Black tries to do the same, starting to counterattack on the other side, but Gotham just ignores it, continues to push his pawn, and we have some nice tactics here. Black takes the d-pawn, threatening to capture the knight, but Gotham doesn't care. He captures as well, opening up these files, threatening his own counterattack on the knight. So Black tries to jump forward, counterattacking this knight, and still threatening to take this pawn, but Gotham takes with check when the king recaptures, the queen slides over, the king hides, and then the knight comes in, and you can see this has been an utter disaster for Black. It is just how quickly these situations can fall apart in the Tau variation. Now, Black is only down 2 pawns at the moment, but obviously the king is wide open, which is why the evaluation is sky high, and we're going to get to see the beautiful attack that leads to checkmate here. Black doesn't resign. They first try and attack the knight, but Gotham now takes the pawn, defending the knight and setting up potential mating threats with this rook now as well that it's involved. Black then tries to trade off the queen, which would just be a blessing for them right now, given how weak this king is. But Gotham has a nice tactic. He jumps forward with his knight. The problem is they can't take the knight with the pawn, because if you do, you have this check. Only move is to block with the bishop, and then the rook coming down is mate in 2. So Black can't do that. Instead, they try and run away with the king, but this is made in 2 as well. There's too many pieces, and you'll see why. First, the queen moves to g6. The king's only square is this square here on e7, and then a nice double check. We have knight g8 checkmate. The rook covers the Black king's escape square. It's a double check, so no one can throw themselves in front of it, and Gotham wins the game from there. That's it for this video. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed, and above me should be a video that the YouTube algorithm thinks you'll like, so click that and enjoy the rest of your day.